Welcome to the fourth Berges lecture for the fall 2015, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to John Davies, who has served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Baton Rouge Area Foundation since June of 1988. I won't ask how old some of the people are, if they were even born during that year. But the Baton Rouge Area Foundation is a community foundation that serves southern Louisiana. During the past 16 years, the foundation has collaborated to spark the revitalization of downtown Baton Rouge and revived a neglected area of the city. It's raised and granted more than $45 million for rebuilding a stronger South Louisiana after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And after the Gulf of Mexico oil leak, the foundation made grants of over $100 million BP gift to deep water rig workers who are suffering financial hardships. We heard about many other people, but not that much about the actual workers who were displaced. Under John's leadership, the foundation has created the Water Institute of the Gulf, a scientific institution responsible for generating unassailable science that will guide the restoration and protection of the Louisiana coast. And John mentioned to me today that he planned to stay about 6 years, and he's now in his 27th year tenure at the foundation, but it has grown from $5 million back in the 80s to more than $550 million in assets today. And over its lifetime, the foundation has granted nearly $400 million to fund nonprofits throughout South Louisiana. He's the son of a former U.S. diplomat, spent his formative years in Lima, Peru, and did his high school or finished his high school in Washington, D.C., and has an undergrad degree from UNC Asheville. John, it's a pleasure to have you here, and you see his title, and let's join me in giving a warm Notre Dame welcome to John Davies.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I have visited Lima, Ohio, but I grew up in Lima, Peru. They're two different towns. Let me outline what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. First, I want to make the case for why community foundations and why you should care about community foundations. Second, I want to talk about the evolution of philanthropy over the past 3 decades. I want to talk about the impact of the cultural shifts on not-for-profit organizations that serve our nation. And I'll make the case that those events have dramatically changed the way in which we do business as public charities. I'll provide you examples to illustrate that point. And I'll argue that the ethical boundaries have shifted in a manner that far more aligns activist public charities with strong moral positions as they serve the disenfranchised. Finally, I want to cite some examples of an entity that we control, that we own, that our foundation runs. It's a real estate investment trust, to illustrate how social entrepreneurship has blurred or even erased the lines between traditional not-for-profit space and the for-profit arena. First, community foundations. Although the first community foundation was funded over 100 years ago in Cleveland, the community foundation movement has evolved dramatically and refined itself to emerge as an important tool of philanthropists at the community level. Community foundations are essentially a mutual fund of charitable funds. So we take in funds from donors and then we disperse them consistent with their wishes. We serve as a back office to high net worth individuals so that they can achieve their charitable goals. In our case, we have approximately 400 of these donor advised funds, and they're very effective ways in which to aggregate not only financial capital, but also the human capital of leadership in our community behind very important endeavors. We also, in our foundation in particular, have developed a penchant for leadership initiatives. And other progressive foundations do the same thing. They view their role as more than just a charitable checkbook for high net worth people, but also as leadership vehicles to address challenges in a community in a very aggressive way. Community foundations are recognized by the IRS as a public charity, so we benefit from the most favorable rules in terms of use of money, in terms of deductibility of gifts that are given to us. So there are huge incentives to give to public charities like us rather than private foundations, what you would think of as foundations like the Ford Foundation or Rockefeller, MacArthur, Gates, etc. And because of all those factors, community foundations are the fastest growing and most dynamic sector in philanthropy. To give you an idea, a sense of what it means, this shift toward community foundations in terms of vibrancy, I took over the foundation 27 years ago. We had about $8 million in assets. We gave away about $300,000. Within 10 years, as we tracked statistics compiled by my colleague, in fact, at the Columbus Foundation in Ohio, we recognized that sometime in the mid-90s, 1995, I think it was, that the 400 community foundations in the United States raised more money than all the United Way organizations in America. That was startling to us. That was a breathtaking realization. And what's even more incredible is that that gap has just yawned. So community foundations now raise consistently increasing dollars over the United Ways, which were the other leg of the philanthropic pillar in most communities. So if you look back then at where we were then and where we are now, we have grown pretty dramatically. This was early on, and just this year, I will tell you that we will far surpass our community foundation, our United Way partner in Baton Rouge. We will raise about $40 million. We'll give away about 30. They will raise about 10, and they'll give away about 8. And if you think of that, now 27 years later, the United Way in our community is giving away about the same amount of money that it did 27 years ago. So there's been a dramatic shift in the way communities respond to major philanthropic bodies. This same scenario, this is not unique to us. It's not because I'm brilliant. Well, maybe it's because I'm a little bit brilliant, but it's mostly because this is a national trend. This is happening all over the United States. The generation that preceded my generation is frequently referred to now as the greatest generation, thanks in large part to Tom Brokaw. They were very faithful to institutions. They gave because they believed in organizations. So they would give to the Boy Scouts, and they would call me, and donors would say, would you send a $10,000 gift to the Boy Scouts, or to the Salvation Army, or to the you name it, to the Red Cross. And as they did that, there was never a question about effectiveness. There was never a question about the board of directors and how they were put together and who they represented. There was never a question about kind of programmatic goals and how to be measured against those goals. The attachment was primarily emotional. And that's basically how that generation of people responded to philanthropy. Now, what's happened since then is that donor-advised funds have increased the awareness in that generation and the following ones that you can make a difference with your philanthropy. You can, in fact, make a grant and have an expectation for a return. And that led to the burgeoning growth that I've just described to you. The growth was so extraordinary that you found that private money managers started stepping into the space. So the Fidelity Gift Trust Fund was started by Fidelity in Boston. They, in fact, their gift trust fund, which is a donor-advised fund, is now the largest donor-advised fund in the United States with something around north of $10 billion in assets. But what's most interesting about this whole movement is it not only helped people focus their philanthropy, but it democratized giving. Because you didn't have to establish a foundation with $50 million, it would spin off 5% of that to be granted out, in thoughtful awards. You could start a fund at a community foundation, or in this case at Fidelity, or at Schwab, or at any number of financial institutions. With $10,000, you could suggest how it might be invested, and then you could distribute either the fruit or the corpus for whatever your charitable benefit was. So it really helped democratize giving in a very dramatic way in our country. In recent years, we have seen those strategies change yet again as the younger kind of yellow suspendered hedge funders and the tech founders get into philanthropic activity because they're more interested in causes. They're far less interested in institutions. In other words, a donor would call our donor services officer and ask about a particular opportunity. For example, I want to build a clinic in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. I'm worried that there is very little primary care, and I'm not sure exactly how to do that, but would you look into it and suggest how we might both build a clinic and then staff it and run it with volunteers and maybe some paid professional staff to run the office, but volunteer physicians and nurses and nurse practitioners and such. She would ask us to provide a business plan. So we would develop a business plan, suggest a process, and we'd put a budget on the implementation. The donor would then pay for the development of that plan, and once the strategic plan had been affirmed by the data and presented to the donor, we're off to the races. And we would launch that and put it to work. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. And that is, in fact, a specific example of a project that we did in Ouagadougou. And I'll give anyone $10 who can spell Ouagadougou without looking at their smartphone. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And it was a great success. And we did multiple more like that. This is a concrete example of how donors and philanthropists have become, their appetite has not been satiated by little reports. They want to actually change the world. So a dramatic and global example of that, of this new model of philanthropy, and I'm making this simple because we could spend half an hour on this very topic if I didn't simplify it, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation campaign to eradicate malaria. I'm giving them credit, but really the World Health Organization, many other folks, and very many nations have been involved through their health departments in getting this done. But Bill and Melinda Gates really put a focus on this, put a timeline, put a demand, and said, we have to succeed in eradicating malaria. And they did a study and developed a multi-year global strategy to erase malaria from humanity. They put the cost of that eradication at somewhere between $90 or $120 billion, $90 and $120 billion. You can kind of see that here. You can see the number of countries on the left and then the cost on the right to get to zero. But if you spend $90 to $120 billion eradicating malaria, you have the economic gain, as they estimate it, of something like $2 trillion in terms of productivity and health savings. So it's an extraordinarily ambitious plan, but it's a plan that has a significant ROI that's multiples of the dollars invested. There are also times when these efforts get to be cautionary tales. That is, they don't quite go the way the donor intended. And that frequently happens when the plan is either unsound and emotional or the gift is impulsive. And there was one very high-profile case of that, and that was when Mark Zuckerberg agreed, this is he with Cory Booker, who was then mayor of Newark, but is now senator from New Jersey, as most of you know. When he and Cory Booker agreed that they were going to fix the public schools in Newark, and Zuckerberg agreed to put up $100 million if it were matched with another $100 million, and they could do it within 5 years. Well, I'm not going to get into the ugly kind of way that played out, but in essence, it was really, by the way, they did that using the Silicon Valley Foundation community foundation in the Silicon Valley in California, because that's Zuckerberg's kind of home base. And as another aside, I will tell you that Zuckerberg has given them, I tallied it up, $1.6 billion into his fund at the foundation. So it's really a pretty extraordinary contribution. It shows you the power of community foundations and their attraction. But this plan didn't work, and unfortunately, it failed in a very public way. It does not take away the merit of this kind of approach, which is cause-based and not organizational-based. Now, if you think about the implications of that, they're really significant, right? There are over 1 million charitable organizations in the United States of America. And if all of a sudden we get to be agnostic about who does the work and demanding on outcomes, regardless of who does the work, then all of a sudden the not-for-profit organizations that have served this country well, I would argue, are going to be put under tremendous competitive pressure to be better at their game, or they will not survive because they won't be able to deliver on the funders' requirements. I would tell you, although this promises a very tumultuous time for not-for-profit organizations in our country, I also think it's a very healthy event and will make us better at serving those who live on the edges of our community. So with this evolution, obviously there's been kind of a change in the way we have, in a societal way, approached philanthropy. One is there's this whole movement toward an impact investing model, which is really kind of a businessman's approach, right? It's the way a venture capitalist would look at making an investment. You're going to figure it out. You're going to develop a plan. If you fund a third party, you're going to hold them responsible, and you're going to keep money on the sidelines and put money in as there is success. If there is no success, the funding stops. And so the continuing grant support comes with mile markers of success. And the other more slowly evolving kind of reality now in this world is being developed by a friend of mine, David Wood, who's now at Harvard. It's the whole idea that you can have multiple bottom lines to any endeavor, whether it be whether it be a for-profit company or a not-for-profit, that you needed to think in terms of multiple bottom lines. The Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard actually began at Boston College, where David was prior to going to Harvard. And they've done really phenomenal work encouraging people to look at making investments in small organizations that provide a social benefit, but also a bottom line return. He has managed to talk some pretty large investment houses, pension funds, into carving out portions of their portfolio to invest in this fashion in order to have social impact and make a big difference. We think of it really in terms of a triple bottom line. We think that you have to have a financial return or you can't sustain it, right? You have to be environmentally sensitive and conscientious, but there also has to be some sort of social benefit. And most frequently, when we look at this area, we think about social benefit as being equitable. So if we're doing if it has to do with housing, we have to be across the economic boundaries in terms of the folks who live there. It cannot be exclusive. It cannot be an economic monoculture because they're corrosive, whether they be gated communities with wealthy people or whether they're poor ghettos. They're equally corrosive to the soul because they counter the whole sense of what community really is. It's interesting because, just to finish a point before I talk about this, the movement that David has helped really champion has drawn now some pretty significant support from both Kresge and the Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. They have a large foundation grant to encourage organizations and municipalities to invest their funds in ways that are much more socially responsible. So before I launch into running through what we have been doing in one of our subsidiaries, the Wilbur Marvin Foundation, which I think will be interesting to you because it really does speak, I think, to the subject matter here in a very pointed way. I'd like to talk about a couple I'd like to make one point that I think guides us in terms of our core DNA, who we are and how we function. We have serious civic leadership initiatives in our community. They're very aggressive. We tend to engage the public sector in a very significant way. We work with the state of Louisiana, where we are headquartered, and we work with the city of Baton Rouge and the city of New Orleans, the mayors. So we're very involved in the public process, working with the public sector. And we do it for the same reason that Willie Sutton robbed banks. We do it because they have the money and they can affect social change most dramatically, right? I mean, they really can. So for us to lever our small amounts of money to make sure that they're doing appropriate things that advance the cause for all people is really important to us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to my Marvin examples. One of the things that we've come to conclude is, and I know you guys have learned this because you have very good instructors and you deal with ethics on an ongoing basis. I didn't have that advantage in school, is that what is legal is not necessarily ethical and vice versa, right? So we worry about what is ethical and a lot less about what is legal. We really try to do the right thing, and if occasionally it bounces into trouble, we'll deal with the trouble if we do it for the right reason. We're currently working on a project to decriminalize the mentally ill in South Louisiana, where we are. As you probably know, the modern day mental health institution is either prison or jail, right? Now, let me clarify, because I had to understand this as we got into it. Jail is where you go temporarily. You're not adjudicated, right? That's where you go to hold. You typically haven't been tried. You're going there because you're being held to be presented before a judge for some misdeed that you committed. And prison's where you go serve a sentence. So if you take that one step further, prisons are pretty stable, despite wonderful shows like Oz. I mean, they're fairly stable. See how hip I am? I know there's a show called Oz. They're fairly stable communities. They're going to be there a while, and everybody gets it. And so the program is stable. Jails are tumultuous. They're changing every night with different bookings and people coming in and going out. And they're really very dangerous places because of that. There are more people in jail than there are in prison, as you might imagine. But in our jail, we came upon, because we were dealing with the mentally ill, and the fact that 40%, at least 40%, up to 60% of the folks in our jail have suffered from mental illness and are probably there as a result of that we thought that was just unacceptable. But the other unacceptable factor is that out of those 1,800 people, many of them are awaiting adjudication. Some of them are serving short-term sentences, but most of them are awaiting adjudication. And that means they have not been found guilty. In the United States of America, they're considered innocent, right? And the truth is that that's just shocking. And so we are actually addressing that with some programs. But to put a finer point on that, in New York City, there was a study done of Rikers Island, and out of 100 people whose bail was set at $500 or less, 40% stayed in jail while their cases were being decided because they could not pay that nominal amount, right? Keep in mind, these are men and women who are being held in jail awaiting judicial action. They've not been found guilty. They simply have been charged, most of them with misdemeanors. It's outrageous. The reason they're sitting in jail is because they can't afford to write a check. And folks who can afford to write the check, walk. I mean, it's really a pretty disgraceful situation. And so we are getting engaged in this. So our program, which dealt only with the mentally ill originally, now has been expanded because this is something that simply can't stand. We've got to have ways to divert people out so that they don't end up in this kind of a circumstance. There's a huge disconnect in this case between what is legal and what is fair and correct and ethical, and we're violating that line here in this situation. I have another story which is a little more humorous. I figured a little levity might be needed about now. Shortly after Hurricane Katrina blew through New Orleans, and the levees failed, which was the real problem, right? A French rescue team based in Paris called the Groupe des Secouristes Français contacted our foundation and offered to send a team of trained firemen. They were going to come help us both in recovery, but also in rescue. So it was really search, rescue, and recovery. Recovery, just to be morbidly specific, is getting corpses out, right? So they were going to help with that. They had dogs. They were remarkable people. The head guy was an amazing. He wanted to go. They wanted to work in St. Bernard Parish. We have civil parishes, not counties, right? So St. Bernard Parish is right east of New Orleans, the worst hit part of this greater New Orleans area. And they had their travel expenses paid for. They had everything lined up, but they needed to be invited by a subdivision of the state. Either the state of Louisiana officially needed to invite them, the city of Baton Rouge, or who knows? I guess those are my choices. Or maybe the mayor of New Orleans, who was somewhere, but not in New Orleans, obviously, at that point. So they sent us that request, said they'd love to come. They had all the money. They'd come and help us. Well, if you think that 1.5 million people evacuated out of South Louisiana, just to remind you, after Katrina and Rita, and they moved elsewhere, and many of them were going in and through Baton Rouge because we were kind of the first point of contact. It was a chaotic time. There was no chance we were going to get anyone to go, get any official declaration. So I huddled up with our graphic artist at the foundation and with our lawyer, and we did a beautiful document. It was really, you guys would be proud of me. It was a beautiful piece of paper, and it was very whereas-y, and and then I signed it with a great flourish. We attached ribbons to it, and then we wanted to make it more official, so we got a little foil, and we used the lawyer's notary seal to really imprint it and really make it really beautiful. And we FedExed it to them, and they were at our place in a week. It was really wonderful how that worked. And there's a really lovely story ending to that story. So the guy who was the head of the team was a guy named Thierry Velou, and he had worked in Ground Zero after 9/11, and so he'd been in the United States and done that work. He really wanted to come to Louisiana because these were where his antecedents came. I mean, we are French Louisiana, right? I mean, we are Louisiana. It's French. It's right. So he wanted to come here. It was emotionally important for him. He's a real character, a real lovely guy. So they came and they worked in rescue and recovery with their fabulous dogs. And then they uncovered an 18-year-old man who'd been lying on his kitchen floor, barely alive. He survived on a jar of peanut butter, and they saved his life. They saved his life, all because we had a little tinfoil, and because we had a notary seal that we could send to France. It's funny because we broke the law, right? I mean, we're frauds. We do not qualify. But the right thing happened, and if something bad had come about on that account, we would have gone and defended ourselves and paid the piper if we had to do that. So I think you can see that we see ourselves a little bit of agents of change, and that's how we view the world. But I also, again, don't think I think we're an example. This is not a situation where I stand before you to tell you how great we are. It's a situation where I stand before you and say, we represent a cohort of community foundations that work in a specific way that we believe is impactful, helpful, and speaks to the future of what will happen in this space of philanthropy. In fact, the whole issue of being ethical in terms of our investment strategies, we're sending our investment committee to meet with David Woods in Cambridge in January to try to put together a portfolio for our investable funds that we would take away from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Private Bank and move into this much more challenging, difficult space. But where we can impact, we can use 95% of our portfolio to make a difference and not just 5%, which is what we currently do. So we are trying to walk the walk that we talk. So let me talk a little bit about the Wilbur Marvin Foundation and why this may be of interest to you. Wilbur Marvin was a real character. He was a real estate developer from New York, went to Harvard, Harvard College undergraduate, came to Baton Rouge in 1952 and started a real estate development company. I've never understood why he came to Baton Rouge, but he did, and we're very grateful that he did. He built a very successful company, real estate development company in Baton Rouge that had properties all over the southeast of the United States and in Puerto Rico. And when he died in 2000, he left us both the development company, that is the the people, right, in the corporation, and also the assets of the company, which at that point was around 50 really crummy strip shopping centers. I shouldn't say that because it feels like I'm being disrespectful to him. But they were very tired shopping centers. That's not much better. Anyway, you know where I'm going. So we have now migrated those into, consistent with our point of view, we have migrated that portfolio into being assets that we believe not only advance communities physically because they work properly, but also advance them in terms of social benefit that they have. I show you this map because you wouldn't understand if I didn't show it to you. There is an old Bon Marché shopping center, which is that red block that you see there. And to its left is a traditional community that had died. It was really in disrepair, and people had evacuated. It ended up with single moms and children and crime and drugs. And so we started a community development effort in that place, and we had organizers working. It was called the Melrose East Community Development Corporation, and they were having some success. But the problem was that right next door was a million-square-foot mall that was empty. It was really dreadful. These are early pictures, but it's 1 million square feet, nothing was in it. And what we understood is that a lot of the nonsense, a lot of the trouble, a lot of the concerns we had were housed here. The troublemakers would come run off to the mall and they would live here because no one was there. It was empty and it was nasty. So we decided we would buy it and develop it and turn it into an office park. And don't laugh because this is Baton Rouge. Don't think you're in Siena. And this is what we developed. So we developed the Bon Carré Business Center. It now has 4,500 people working there. It's incredibly vibrant. It has jobs that benefit the community next door. And we turned this dissolute place into a very successful, effective center of energy for a very tough neighborhood. Florida Street, the street this is on, is kind of the economic and racial dividing line in our community. So that's one example. And we dramatically improve the area, and we also get a nice return on it. It's a little bit of a challenge to lease, but people love it, and it's proved to be a very good program for us. This is downtown. I tell you this because in 1998, 15 years ago, thereabouts, we started a plan to revitalize downtown because we found that mostly affluent white folks were moving to the suburbs and abandoning city centers. So we started something called Plan Baton Rouge, which is a 10-block by 10-block downtown revitalization effort. And we had a master plan done for it, which was superb, by Dwani Platter-Zyberk of Miami, Andres Dwani, who's developed quite a name for himself in town planning. And we implemented that plan. So within 10 years, 99% had been implemented. But one of the problems we had with this is there was this hulking, crashing, burning old hotel that was right on the riverfront. It is 1 block on the Mississippi River, right in the middle of the Mississippi River. And it would burn down because the homeless folks would go in there and they'd start fires and cook. And it was just a disaster. And it was impeding growth in downtown. Other capital wouldn't come in. So so we penciled it and knew that it was going to be hard to make money on it, but we thought it was so important. We went and developed it as the capital city Hilton. We kept it for 5 years and sold it. We lost $500,000 on it when we did it, but it has dramatically changed the face of the city. It has really improved downtown. Among other things, there was no hotel downtown except for a gambling hotel before we did this. Now there are 6 hotels, and I think today a 7th just got approved by the city council. They were going in to ask for a tax increment financing from the city council, a TIF, and I think they got it. So it'll be 7 hotels now in that 10-block by 10-block area where there were none. So that achieved our goal there. We're back to the map again, and if you go north, you'll see there's another full block on the river. The blue would be a river, and I only tell you that because if you've ever seen the Mississippi River, it ain't blue, okay? So north of that, we were asked by the state to to try to incentivize IBM to come to Baton Rouge. And the state said they would give us money to build a building so that they could provide IBM rent for 15 years free if we would build it for them. And then maybe even build some other amenities so that the IBMers that they would attract could live across the way. And we agreed to do that again in the spirit of the Hilton Hotel, that this is an economic driver. We need to diversify our economy away from just petrochemical and oil. We need to build our base in the knowledge economy. And this is going to be the largest data center, development data center that IBM had in North America. 800 development folks working in it. So we agreed to do that. And if I can't explain to you how difficult it is to develop a cooperative endeavor agreement with the state of Louisiana, or any state, frankly, to spend a bunch of money on a private sector deal that's going to make a difference. So we, in fact, built the IBM, didn't pop up, sorry. We built this facility. The IBM is on this side. This is the IBM Tower. Can you see? It's on the right is the IBM Tower. There's a beautiful garden in the middle, parking on 4 stories. And this is an apartment complex on the end with studios, 1 bedrooms, a few 2s, and 2 3-bedrooms, but mostly geared to trying to encourage the millennials to come work who are going to come work at IBM to live and work close together. Because y'all being part of that generation, many of you, know that you don't necessarily want to own anything. You don't want to own a car. You want to own a bike, or maybe rent a bike, and you love walking. And so we did this project. It is now open and running, and it cost us about $74 million. The state's contribution to this project was $34 million, so you can see that we extended ourselves. And finally, the most complicated project is this one here. It's the water campus. We started at the request of our senior senator, Mary Landrieu, and our governor, Bobby Jindal. We started something called the Water Institute of the Gulf. And Pat mentioned it in his introduction. The Water Institute of the Gulf is a science organization. It models after the Dutch science organization Deltaris that provides unassailable science to the country of the Netherlands for them to defend their coastlines, which are much like ours. Those of you who have flown into Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, I don't know if you even know, it's 16 feet below sea level. I mean, it's really pretty incredible if you think about it. And they managed to keep it dry and working despite, weather events and et cetera. So we founded that organization 3 years ago now. And they're up to now 50 scientists, some world-class scientists. When they get together, it looks like the UN. And they're experts in deltaic issues, because we live in one of the great deltas in the world in South Louisiana. And their job is to provide the science to execute the state's plan for coastal protection and restoration. There is an authority called the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority that has responsibility for expending the funds to protect and redevelop the coast. And their budget is nominally about $1.5 billion a year. The science that they will lean on will be the science that comes out of the Water Institute. But what we knew is we couldn't be competitive unless we could aggregate scientists in one place. So with partnership with the state of Louisiana and with the city of Baton Rouge, we cobbled together 35 acres immediately south of town. I've just shown you where. And we're going to build this campus. It's pretty spectacular. And it's pretty amazing if you think that both the city and the state gave us each about 11 acres. In addition to that, the state gave us another $22 million to build what is the Water Institute of the Gulf headquarters on a dock that sticks out into the Mississippi River. Currently, the LSU Center for River Studies, it's a small-scale physical model of the lower Mississippi River, is under construction, and so is the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority's headquarter buildings. Those are underway now. Oh, and we just issued the plans for the engineering to begin putting the steel in for the Twig build, the Water Institute of the Gulf building. It's a pretty ambitious plan and a pretty spectacular plan. We gave LSU this property so that they could build the Center for River Studies. It's about a $500,000 piece of dirt, and we raised the money from Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority to actually build the physical model. What they do is they develop computer models to see how different parts of the coast might respond to different events that might occur. And then they go and they test them out in these labs to see physically if they glean any other knowledge about how, when they replicate that in a small-scale manner, are there any lessons that they might learn that might influence or or give them some nuances in terms of the computer modeling. So this building's under construction. It's modeled after this one here, which is in Delft, the Netherlands. It's the Deltares physical model. They have 5 of these basins, including the delta, and that delta is the Mississippi Delta basins, because they used to do a lot of work in the Netherlands for Louisiana. Now that work will be resident in Louisiana, thanks to the structures I've just shown you. And then finally, this is the Water Institute of the Gulf's, I'm sorry, this is the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority's building. They had to be on the site, and this gets into kind of the business model. They had to be on the site because we needed to be able to have the honeypot in the middle of our organization. Their budget is $1.5 billion a year. They award that to major engineering firms, to major construction firms to do these huge, huge projects along the coast of Louisiana. Well, clearly those guys need to want to be near these guys because they want to influence their decisions as best they can. But the idea is that if you have an event, you want to have the money, the engineering, and the contractors all at the same table so you can come up with solutions. After the oil leak, there was a big debate about how best to keep the oil off the shores of Louisiana. And there's a huge debate about that. And you couldn't get the scientists and the engineers on the same page. It got to be a big debacle that I'm sure it didn't get here, but in Louisiana it was a big deal. Whether you use rocks, whether you use sand, whether you rebuild some of these out islands, the Chandeleur Islands of Louisiana to keep the oil away, or you put down more boom. So there was never any modeling done. In this case, you've got everybody drinking at the same water cooler. You get them at the table, you figure out the solutions, and you move on. So it was essential to get both the Water Institute of the Gulf and these guys at the same place. As a result, what I would tell you is that this project will be a success. It's about 1.2 million square feet of office and research space. It's probably about $800 million in total capital investment. And within 6 to 8 years, we'll have it finalized. And this is the Water Institute of the Gulf building. This is the design we approved last Thursday. And they're going to start fabricating the steel to get it up and running. It'll be a spectacular building. There is nothing on the river in Baton Rouge. And because we're a levee city, the dikes in Baton Rouge are higher than the roads, and so you really can't see the Mississippi in most places. This will live on the river, which is appropriate because the river is both the solution and the problem that we have. The river is dredged so that the sediment doesn't keep continuing to rebuild the coast, right? So it's dredged and pushed off the end into the Gulf, or it's simply pumped out, and so we don't renourish the wetlands in Louisiana. So you can get a sense of how that works. Finally, to connect that whole district, we have been putting a tram in that would run from the city, from the capital of the state down to LSU. We got a Tiger grant from the federal government to do the study, and we've got Secretary Fox, the Secretary of Transportation, U.S. Secretary of Transportation, coming to Baton Rouge next week. And we hope he's coming to announce something good. I'll be at a dinner, so I probably won't eat dinner that night because we've asked him for $140 million to build this. And we're hoping he's going to come with good news. He hasn't said anything, and he's coming. And so, everybody's kind of got their hopes up that this is going to work. But this will be a huge connector that will connect Louisiana State University, our flagship university, with the capital along this very, very important spine that we're developing. So that is kind of our story and how we view social entrepreneurship. I focus mostly on our activities of this foundation that I'm so privileged to serve. But we really are part of a cohort of foundations that is progressive and activist. I believe the world of philanthropy is being shaped by the kind of behavior and the kind of initiatives that you're seeing here tonight. I think this is what more and more folks will do. Central to our capacity to have a strong impact is really that we live by an unwavering set of principles that help us understand what is right and what is wrong, what we need to do and what we can't do. We have the courage of our conviction to pursue projects that will significantly move the social needle because we are grounded in our commitment to doing what is right. And those aren't just words. I really, really mean that. That kind of anchor gives us the strength and capacity to be as creative as we need to be with as few constraints as possible. which is why I think this model is going to be increasingly embraced by other organizations like us. So in this fast-moving world of social entrepreneurship, and progressive institutions no longer define themselves in terms of their tax status. They talk about the work they do, the compelling change that can be achieved through the missions and their actions. That's the world we live in. That's the world that we embrace. And that's the future I hope we'll leave to our children. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Those of you that have been here at other events, we're going to use the, it's not a football, but pretend it's a football. So we'll toss this around and you can speak into it. Who's gonna, maybe I'll start, John, and while the first person, today in my class we talked about stakeholders, and maybe you could, you kind of went through quickly who you view the stakeholders of your, major development there that you were sharing with us.
Okay. Well, the reality is that we believe that we represent everybody. So, and that puts us in a very interesting position, because I think what that allows us to do is to take the high ground. We are not the Chamber of Commerce. We don't represent business. We're not the United Way. We don't represent 51 social service agencies. We are not public. We're not the public sector. We don't represent, some particular affiliation or party. Our whole mission is to advance the quality of life for everybody who lives in our region. And we take that very, very seriously. It's about equity, it's about access, it's about advancing the quality of life for all people. And so when we get into a conversation, very few folks, honestly, they don't question our motives. They really don't. They may think we're nuts, right? They may think we're wrong about something, but they don't think that we have an agenda outside of the agenda of advancing the quality of life for the region. And that's a reputation I think we've earned, frankly.
Good. Room full of people. We have to have a few. Yes, Amy.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed the talk. You mentioned that a huge problem is that there's many individuals who aren't able to make bail at the time of arraignment, and they're incarcerated in the jail system. And I'm curious, if there's a situation where tomorrow is Christmas and you get everything that you wanted, how would you protect the mentally ill from ending up in that situation?
All right, so our plan is based on a model that is being used in Austin, Texas very successfully. And that is that you've got to divert people outside of the process so they never get booked. So there's a whole what they call a restoration center in Austin, where policemen are trained, first of all, they're trained to deal with people who are struggling with mental emotional issues. So they know how to identify it and they know how to respond to it. They know how to get out of their command voice and how to talk. They're trained up in terms of dealing with this. CIT training, I forget what that stands for. But anyway, so you train them, and then they make the analysis and determine someone who's off their meds wanders into someone's house. And the guy or lady calls the police and says, I've got a stranger in my home, come take him away, right? Instead of breaking entry or whatever, the policeman says, this person's mentally ill. Lady, do you mind if I take him and get him treatment? She says, no. He does not go to get booked. He goes directly into this restoration center. And he immediately gets whatever treatment he needs immediately. Now, it's not a permanent solution. It's a short-term solution. But then after that, they refer them out into a continuum of care. So that's what we need to do. Let me give you an example of how that worked in Austin. In Austin, they were going to build their jail holds 2,800 people. They were going to add another 1,000 beds at some huge capital costs. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? But they decided, they had some folks come in and talk to them, enlightened people could talk to them, and they talked about having this restoration center, having this diversion capacity. So they said, well, why don't we hold off building anything right now and let's see what happens. This is 2005, by the way. Let's see what happens. So they developed their diversion program, and now we are what? We're 10 years later, okay? 10 years later, they run a census in their current prison of 2,800 capacity. They run a census of minus 750 on that number, so they're at about 2,150. They have 750 empty beds every night. It's remarkable. And there's been no impact in terms of public safety and all the things that, some of the concerned people were talking about. That's what we think is the much better model. And I'm not sure that they have it perfect yet, but they're the best model we have found to date.
Thank you.
Who'll be next here?
Do you mind just re-explaining the difference between a community fund and a mutual fund and or any other type of charity?
Okay. So the community foundation is a public charity. That's the first important issue, right? So a public charity gets certain benefits by the IRS. If you give to them, you get to write off the donation. You write it off at a higher level than if you give to a private foundation. There are self-dealing rules that affect private foundations, like Ford MacArthur or someone's family foundation, for example. So the advantage to starting a fund at a community foundation is that you get all those benefits. You also get the benefit of having a back office of very smart people who know your community cold, so you can ask questions and get great answers about what the options are to work in a space that you have an interest in, whether it be healthcare or education or social services or whatever. So that's the difference between us and private foundations. Mutual funds, I use that as an analogy, is probably a poor one. But the point is we can reduce the cost of running our foundation by having hundreds of people have funds with us. So we have about $600 million in assets. Well, the overhead gets spread out over $600 million, representing probably in this case almost 1,000 funds, of which about a little more than half of them are donor-advised funds. So you get to have very inexpensive and very high-level service for your charitable goals from your community foundation. I just use mutual fund as an example, right? It's not really a mutual fund. But the mutual fund business got into this world because they saw a capability to expand their services and to hold on to their clients. Otherwise, their clients would send large checks to community foundations and they would lose that asset, that investable asset. So the reason the Fidelities of the world got engaged is not because they wanted to be charitable, but because they wanted to retain the investments for the investment fees and et cetera, right?
Hi. Okay,
Hi.
kind of along with the last question, for someone who's interested in going into the nonprofit sector as on the management side rather than trying to contribute through your community foundation, would you suggest going into the community foundation sector or starting a nonprofit that specifically deals with the subject that you're interested in?
I love the sector. I love it. And I've been in it so long that I'm probably irrational. I just believe that we're the point of the spear right now. And it can change. I mean, it really can change. But right now, we are really doing some extraordinary work. And so I'd encourage you to get engaged with a progressive community foundation. And we have an organization of about 12 to 15 of us that get together regularly, and we share the same values. And so it's very wonderful to get together because we juice each other up. The field's probably now up to 1,000 community foundations, I would tell you. Any of size are probably 100 or less, right? So there'd be 100 or fewer community foundations who have, let's say, $100 million or more. There are some very, very small ones, too. But I'd encourage you to get engaged in the field. The field is great. Starting a charity, I fear, unless it's very focused and very, very effective, is going to be increasingly challenging over time because of the scenario I just played out for you. I do believe that high net worth folks who have significant, Zuckerberg is a perfect example in terms of the money he's spending and the way he's spending it. He wants certain goals achieved and he doesn't care who does them. He just wants to impact and he wants an outcome. He wants to make a cause, either go away or accelerate. I mean, he doesn't care. He is absolutely agnostic as to who generates the achievement. He wants the achievement. And Bill and Melinda Gates, the malaria thing's a perfect example. Playing at these big stages, and that's starting now to come down and infiltrate smaller donors. So I think increasingly, charities are going to have a harder challenge making their case unless they're very, very good at what they do. The whole impact investing model is worth looking at. because that's going to be the current metric, I think, in terms of, are you doing a good job and can I invest in you? I think that's probably a pretty good model to look at to guide you if you decide to go that pathway.
Last question, anyone?
I don't know if I can see that far. Hi, excuse me. I was curious, since you work so closely with the city and state and with Baton Rouge, what kind of financial transparency is necessary for your company when you're doing so many different projects, and what kind of financial information is required to be provided to them throughout the
That's a great
process?
question. So when we work with the public sector, and we do that a lot, we try to carve out that work and we put it in a subsidiary company so that those books can go anywhere they need to go. What we don't want to do is we don't want to give out donor information if our donors don't want to give it out. That's our issue. That's why we would do that. It's not because we have anything to hide. We just have some donors who have very, very large funds with us, and they don't necessarily want the world to know that, right? That they've got a $20 million fund at the Baton Rouge Area Foundation. We have a professor, I guess I can say this, we have a professor at Southern University who lives a very, very modest life and is just a very lovely person. She has this very significant fund with us. She's incredibly wealthy. No one at the university, Southern University is historically black university. It's the largest one in the country. None of her colleagues know that she's wealthy. And she would hate if they did because she thinks it would change her relationship with them. So we protect her incredibly. So they don't know. We anonymous grants and try to make sure there's no way it's trackable back to her interests and et cetera. That's our purpose for separating. Also, there's so many different auditing possibilities that we want to be able to have one clean set of books that they can look at that refers to that particular project. So if you were to look at our organizational chart, we have a lot of entities that hang underneath us that are what you would call a subsidiary, but they're charitable versions of that. They're called supporting organizations.
Thank you, John. It was very
Thank you.
insightful.